guys, Katie here from Equestrian Movement, and today we're going to be talking about one of those fun topics of why does my horse buck? So there's quite a few reasons that we can be looking at with our horses with regards to their bucking. So we're going to list them out and go from there. So if you're finding you're yesing any of these, let me know. I'd love to hear back from you. Love to hear if we can help you sort the bucking issues out with your horse. So first and foremost at Equestrian Movement, our philosophy is to first do no harm. So the first thing that we are ruling out are pain-related issues associated with bucking. So saddle fit, teeth, ulcers, anything that is going to be causing discomfort with your horse is potentially going to lead to bucking. So then the question is, it's such a minefield of trying to figure out if there is something happening that is pain related with your horse. It can be really difficult to troubleshoot this one. So that's why at Equestrian Movement we do lots of consent work. If you can get your horse to be cueing you in the earlier stages of getting ready to ride and in the tacking up process, then you'll start to recognize where there might be a particular problem associated with one thing. The hardest part about troubleshooting issues like bucking is that there is so many underlying causes. You can get really stuck going around in circles trying to figure out what the real issue is with your horse and how you're going to move forward with it. So when we do our consent work, quite often I have horses that have come in with trauma associated with bit pressure, and so if we are doing our consent work, they won't consent the bridle, and then that if we are trying to push them through that and try and ride them anyway, that can be a reason for them bucking under saddle, is when they feel the bit pressure. Same with the saddle. So if we're asking our horses to put the saddle on and we're doing the consent work around that, they won't consent the saddle if it's causing them pain. They will be giving you signals when you're trying to do the girth up if they've got ulcers. Not always with ulcers, ulcers can be a little bit tricky, but you can quite often see issues with girthiness and not wanting to consent the saddle before you're even in the saddle having the problems. Another issue that I will see a lot of with the actual bucking itself is when we go to do the mounting process. And so for me, when I first started learning how to be a trainer, I had a really big fall with a 16 3-hand warm blood who had problems with mounting. So as I would go to mount, swing myself into the saddle with only one foot in the saddle and the other leg not even over the saddle yet, he would start bronking. And it got me into this situation where I was absolutely terrified of mounting horses, especially mounting unknown horses, and especially mounting this horse in particular. So kind of took me down the rabbit hole a little bit there with how we can identify if our horse is going to have problems with mounting itself before we're getting into the saddle. There's quite a few things to be looking for when we're mounting, is that making sure that your toe isn't dragging into their ribs. So this, I think, was the underlying cause for this particular horse's problems. I had been drilled as a kid to do a pony club mount where you face the hindquarters and in one clean action you stand into the stirrup and swing your leg over and sit into the saddle, and I never actually perfected it. So instead of doing a really nice clean mount that I could do if I wasn't trying to do a pony club mount, I ended up getting this really awkward, useless mount that was completely detrimental to the horses, where I'd start facing the hindquarters and then I would jump my way around to where I was comfortable to mount from and then stand up and swing over from there. So in that process of me jumping around, I was also digging my toe into his ribs and then pulling myself up into the saddle. So that was definitely causing him significant discomfort that he was associating with the mounting process. When we are looking at mounting our horses, we really need that athletic spring to make sure that we're getting into the saddle in a way that is good for our horse's back. There is a lot of damage that we can do when we're pulling ourselves up that twists the saddle on the horse's back and create pressure points and pain in along their spine, and particularly if they're like holding their lower back to kind of brace against us as we pull ourselves up. Any situation where we're going to like create tension, where our horse is holding themselves, is going to potentially that, you know, they're holding themselves because we're pulling and twisting their back. But then in the step after that, so when we ask them to walk on, you know, we're asking them to release that tension that they were holding in their body to prevent us from actually injuring their back while we were trying to pull ourselves on. So I've done a lot of work with the mounting process itself. True to being in the industry, once I kind of like overcame the mounting issue with this particular horse, of course I had a bunch of horses with mounting issues. One of them in particular got fired from the police force because he was bucking every time he was getting mounted and nobody could actually mount him safely. And so there is definitely a significant proportion of horses that, you know, they have problems with the way that we actually mount and climb onto their back. So making sure that when we're getting into the saddle, we're not twisting the saddle on the horse's back, and we're sitting gently, we're not kicking them in the butt on the way over. Like, there's plenty of ways that if we're not actually concentrating on how we get ourselves into the saddle, we're going to be antagonizing our horse and making them feel uncomfortable at best and creating pain at worst. So creating a good mounting technique where you are balanced and in control of your body and not just plonking yourself into the saddle and, you know, not twisting the saddle on their back is really important to ensuring the long-term soundness of their back, as well as the short-term like aggravation of not wanting to mount. So we can do our consent work around the bridle, the tack, and then we also do the consent work around mounting and making sure that we're mounting appropriately. The next place that we can see issues with our horses' bucking problems is if we've got the musculoskeletal alignment off. So quite often, if you're in like the introductory stages of training with your horse, and you're trying to like get them into a frame, if you're just asking for submission to the bit and you're creating lightness because of the like just tucking their nose behind the contact and getting them to come into a frame because they're tucking their nose instead of elevating the forehand, what you're going to be doing is creating a musculoskeletal misalignment by creating posterior pelvic tilt. So I'm going to also do an extra video for this where I've got some video of a horse that has this issue and that actually bucks over a pole because of it. So I'm going to attach the link to that video so you can have a look at what it looks like when our horses have posterior pelvic tilt that is interfering with their musculoskeletal alignment and how that is an antagonizing factor towards bucking. So in particular, if you're seeing bucking after like poles or jumps or after a cannon transition, anything where your horse has gone from, you know, in trot they have a very flat movement because of that diagonal pair, whereas in canter it has natural roundedness to the gait, so that there's like the scope of the canter comes up through the back, and so they have to use their whole back to actually give us a canter stride, whereas in the trot they can get away with like staying quite hollow and tight through their back. So we don't notice that their back isn't warmed up appropriately. If they like just tuck their nose into contact and into a frame, they can have the rotation of the pelvis, and so instead of sitting deeper and flexing through their hocks, they are just rotating the pelvis to get the flexion of the neck and the give at the pole. So this is what we call a false frame, where it's not engaging their musculoskeletal alignment, it's not engaging their top line muscle for them to actually come into a frame. They'll be breaking away at the third vertebrae instead of seeking the contact, working into your hands and then coming up through the base of the wither to come up into contact. So we'll see this translate through to issues with bucking under saddle, particularly if our horse needs to actually use their back to do what we're asking them to do in cases of canter poles, grid work, jumps, canter transitions, sometimes even like just transitions walk to trot poles. Like if their back is really tight, there's plenty of places here where they can have that tightness through their back that's going to trigger bucking. So make sure you watch that video of what it looks like when the horse is working like that. If you think that this might be the reason why your horse is bucking, feel free to reach out. This is basically why we have put our membership together, working towards self-carriage, is that it's how we are going to tier in and use our training exercises for musculoskeletal alignment and good posture, so that we are working our horses for soundness, so that they are seeking our hands for contact and communication, and we're not just flexing them into submission onto the bit. And then that also develops their athletic potential, because then they can scale the dressage training scale, or they can scale the show jump heights because their body is sound and they are holding the best posture for their conformation. So thirdly to that, there's an idea that our horses should just let us ride them. And so continuing on from the conversations that we had last week, there can be a point where our horses are just like braced against us because they don't want us on their back. So one of the things that we have been working on at the School Equestrian Spirit is we have our communication buttons, and one of the buttons is for scratches and one of the buttons is for hugs. And seeing as though these horses aren't actually my students' horses, they're the school horses, there isn't like a whole lot of emotional connection and relationship there between the horse and rider. Obviously the riders enjoy the horses and the horses are like, I'm happy enough to be ridden, but the depths of that emotional relationship aren't necessarily there, because it is kind of just a job, and then they're not as close as, you know, the horses in our backyard can be like family, with how much we are like working with them and engaging with them and feeding them and all that kind of thing. So one of the skills that we've been working on in the school is giving horses a hug that they actually enjoy. And so what it's like, you know, when you watch someone give somebody a hug and they're not particularly giving it from their heart, and so they're like quite tight through their body, and it's like a little tap tap tap, oh, that's not really a hug, but I'm trying to show that I care for you and I'm here for you. So we can see this with the students with the horses, as they kind of like give a really awkward hug where they're trying to embrace, but there's still walls up and there's still boundaries. And so the rider is like really tight through their body and not melting into the horse, and the horse is like really tight and braced against the hug, and then, you know, at best they're just like showing that friction, and at worst they're like giving ugly faces like, I don't really like what you're doing, like back off, you know, give me some space, give me some distance. So this has been really interesting, because at the same time that we're doing this work, I'm also backing a horse that's come for breaking. And I was sitting on her the other day. I was like, I think the second or third time that I was sitting on her. And, you know, when you can feel that same level of tension in the horse, my body goes tense as well. Like, my body is in that defense mechanism of like, this horse is potentially going to buck at any stage because she hasn't softened and let me into her back yet. And so normally at that point, what I would do is dismount and reinforce relaxation, and that all I need her to do is stand still, let me on her back, hop off, reinforce, hop back on, stand still, relax, hop back off. But in this instance, with like it fresh in my mind, working on this hug work with the students, I was like, just started scratching at the base of her wither and her neck. And as I was scratching, she like softened in her body a little bit and relaxed a little bit. And as she softened and relaxed, I was softening and relaxing and scratching more. And then as I was scratching more, she was softening and relaxing. And so I was softening and relaxing. And it was like that same kind of like abrasive friction that I'm watching my students get when they're trying to hug, was like her allowing me onto her back. She was not softening and allowing me into her back. She was kind of just like bracing herself and holding herself against me. So having your horse like invite you into their back, one of the things that I like to see is if they like square out and brace themselves for you to hop on. So that was one of the signals that she had already been giving me, is she'd like squared out her hind legs to support my weight while I was climbing myself onto her. That's always a good indication that they're ready for you to hop on. But then she was still like holding herself quite tight. When we're backing a horse, I would prefer not to have to buck. Well, I don't buck horses out. I'm not that rider. I do the work on the ground to get the relaxation and the consent and allowing for that integration and that union. So that's particularly because I work with a lot of horses that have experienced trauma early on, but also I work with a lot of beginners. And so none of my students are going to be able to buck a horse out or ride a horse that is going to start bucking. So it's easier for me to train a horse to not buck in the first place than to try and sit them and buck them out. Plus I don't love like where their headspace is at for them to have to buck to like, you know, work through the buck or push through the buck or whatnot. So in my opinion, I prefer to just not let them know that they have the option of bucking in the first place. And so that just means that I do things a bit slower so that they are like ready for the next ask. As an example, this mare in particular, we were ready to start backing her, and instead I decided to take her out on in-handed benches because I just knew that you know, the relationship could have been a bit stronger. I wanted her to look to me and trust me a bit more to like get to that place of being on her back a little bit like more connected. So instead of going straight into backing, we started going out onto in-hand walks, in-hand adventures to build her confidence in me, to guide her through challenges and whatnot. So it's been really interesting, you know, thinking about how like that allowing and that softening of the horse to allow us into their back, you know, it translates on the ground and then it also translates through into saddle. So the quality of your relationship on the ground is definitely going to affect the quality of the integration in the saddle. And so lastly, our horses can hold tension if they hold worry. So our foundational philosophies at Equestrian Movement are: first, do no harm. So we rule out any reason for our horses to say no in the first place due to pain or what have you, or discomfort. And then we're using our groundwork to develop mental relaxation and emotional self-regulation. So basically what we're doing is we're giving our horses the skills to empty their worry cup. Because what happens is we're going to ask something to do them and they might hold a little bit of tension, hold a little bit of worry, but it's manageable. And then we ask them to do something else, and then we ask them to do something else, and we ask them to do something else, and we're just like worry stacking. We haven't emptied the cup. And then eventually we hit that threshold where they're no longer coping with the amount of pressure and stress that we're putting on them, and so they can no longer control their behavior because they can no longer control their emotions. And so that's where we end up with, you know, the explosion out of nowhere, is because they were like holding themselves together until they couldn't hold themselves together any longer. So being able to, again, like empty their worry cup in a way that allows them to let go of that brace and that tension through through their body, because that then also has flow-on effects to how they work physically. Like if they're holding themselves with worry and they aren't able to mentally relax, then, you know, they're going to hold their body with worry, and so they're already holding their body to try and balance us. And then if we end up like tucking their nose into contact and then they're bracing and holding their body because of poor posture, then we're also kind of stacking poor movement on top of poor movement, and so we're creating pain issues. Just the fact that they have to hold us in the first place is going to make them brace their back. And then if they're holding worry, and then if they're not holding good posture, and we're doing training techniques that forces the posture to go into the wrong direction, then, you know, we're creating pain on top of pain on top of pain. And again, that's also going to hit like that threshold where they're not going to be able to do it anymore, because a horse that can't control its emotions can't control its behaviors. So if you've got a horse that's got bucking problems, and any of these particular scenarios relate to you, we'd love to hear from you. We currently have a free training that goes into that, you know, how to use your exercises for musculoskeletal soundness, postural alignment, that's going to deal with bucking issues, and that's in the link below, www.equestrianmovement.com/drilling circles. Check out the comment section to get the link to the horse that is bucking over pole. So it has the posterior pelvic tilt that is interfering with its musculoskeletal alignment, which is resulting in bucking. And if you think that that's you, pop over to that free training, have a look at the different exercises that we do to try and support their development through that process. And if you want the laid out, done for you exercise plans, we do have that in our membership. You can have a look at our membership over at www.equestrianmovement.com/the Arena Grande. Until next week, happy trails.